The first thing Caleb Mercer heard that morning was a woman screaming for help from the far end of his pasture. It was not the kind of scream that came from fear of a rattlesnake or a horse gone lame. It was the sound of someone who had already run out of hope. Caleb dropped the bridle he was repairing and turned toward the cottonwoods along the creek. The November wind swept dust across the yard, rattling the tin roof of the barn and carrying the smell of cold rain from somewhere beyond the hills. Then he heard it again. Please. Somebody! Caleb was in the saddle before the third cry. He rode hard toward the creek, his black gelding picking its way over the frozen ground. Caleb Mercer was a broad-shouldered rancher in his early 40s, a man who had spent 20 years learning when to fight and when to walk away. Folks in the nearby town called him hard, though nobody who had worked for him called him cruel. He had built the Mercer Ranch from 100 acres of scrubland and one borrowed horse. Now he owned nearly 4,000 acres, but money had never made him careless. As he rounded the cottonwoods, he saw a wagon overturned beside the creek. One wheel was broken. A gray mare lay tangled in the traces, kicking weakly, and beside the wagon stood a woman holding a rifle with both hands. She looked like she had been running for miles. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins. Her brown traveling dress was torn at the shoulder, and there was blood on one sleeve, but it was not her blood. Caleb slowed his horse. The woman raised the rifle. "Stay back." Caleb stopped. "You're on my land." "I know." "You hurt?" "No." "Then whose blood is that?" The woman's eyes flicked toward the overturned wagon. "My husband's." Caleb's expression changed. He looked at the wagon. "Where is he?" The woman swallowed. "He's dead." For several seconds, the only sound was the creek moving beneath a thin sheet of ice. Caleb dismounted. The woman kept the rifle trained on him. "You're trespassing," he said quietly. "I know. You could have gone to town." "I can't." "Why?" Her hands tightened around the rifle. "Because the men who killed my husband are looking for me." That was the moment Caleb noticed the second horse. It was standing behind the wagon, a saddlebred with a silver star, branded into its flank. Caleb knew that brand. Everybody within 50 miles knew. It had belonged to Silas Crow. Crow owned the largest freight company in the county, 3 saloons, half the dry goods stores in town, and enough hired guns to make a sheriff think twice before knocking on his door. Caleb looked back at the woman. "What did your husband do?" "He found something." "What?" "A ledger." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What kind of ledger?" "The kind a man kills for." She lowered the rifle. "Slightly. My name is Eleanor Hart." Caleb stared at her. The name meant something, not to him personally, but he had heard it 2 nights earlier at the Mercantile. Eleanor. Hart was the widow of a railroad bookkeeper who had disappeared after accusing several businessmen of stealing money from a land fund. Caleb had paid little attention. He had no interest in town politics. No interest in railroad men. And absolutely no interest in other people's trouble. That had been his rule since the day his younger brother died. Trouble always came asking for something. Usually, it wanted more than a man could afford to give. Caleb looked toward the hills. "How many men?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know. That wasn't my question." 6, maybe 8. "Armed?" "Yes." "Coming here?" "Yes." Caleb sighed. "You picked a bad place to hide." Eleanor looked at the sprawling ranch behind him. "Why?" "Because if Crow's men are coming, they'll find you." Her face fell. Then Caleb added, "But they'll have to get through me first." Eleanor stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Caleb looked away. He didn't have a good answer. Maybe it was the blood on her sleeve. Maybe it was the dead horse. Maybe it was the way she held herself together even though she was terrified. Or maybe it was because Caleb had once watched a man beg for help while everyone around him decided the problem wasn't theirs. He had never forgiven himself for walking away because you're standing on my land, he said. That doesn't explain anything. It doesn't have to. He walked toward the wagon. Eleanor followed. My husband is underneath. Caleb stopped. I'll get him out. You can't. Why? He's gone. Caleb looked at her. I know. He removed his coat and covered the dead man before lifting the broken wheel. Enough for Eleanor to pull him free. The man had been shot twice. Once in the chest, once in the neck. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had seen enough dead men to know this wasn't robbery. The killer had wanted him. Silent. Caleb searched the man's coat. Nothing. Where's the ledger? Eleanor looked toward the creek. I don't have it. Then where is it? She didn't answer. Caleb stood. Mrs. Hart, I said I don't have it. You also said your husband died because of it. He did. Then somebody has it. Eleanor's eyes met his. My husband hid it before they came. Caleb waited. He told me if anything happened, I was to take the ledger to a man named Caleb Mercer. The wind seemed to stop. Caleb stared at her. You were looking for me? Yes. Why? I don't know. You don't know? He said you were the only man in the county who couldn't be bought. Caleb gave a humorless laugh. Your husband didn't know me very well. He said you saved his life once. Caleb smiled. Disappeared. When? 3 years ago, during the spring flood. A railroad bridge collapsed. You pulled him from the river. Caleb remembered. A young bookkeeper had nearly drowned. Beneath a freight wagon, Caleb had forgotten his name the next morning. Apparently, the man had not forgotten his Eleanor. Reached inside her dress and pulled out a small brass key. Caleb looked at it. What does that open? The ledger. Where is it? My husband didn't tell me. Caleb studied her face. You're telling me you rode across the territory with a key to a ledger you haven't seen while 8 armed men are hunting you? Yes. That is a remarkably poor plan. I didn't have another one. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. Then a rifle cracked from the ridge. The bullet struck the ground between them. Eleanor screamed. Caleb grabbed her and dragged her behind the wagon. Another shot tore through the wagon's wooden side. Caleb pulled his revolver. Stay down. How many? He looked toward the ridge. 3 riders appeared against the pale sky. Then another. Then another. 5. Caleb counted. Them. 5. Eleanor's face went white. You said 8. I was hoping you were wrong. They're Crow's men. Caleb checked the cylinder of his revolver. Then they know you're here. What do we do? Caleb looked toward the ranch. There were barns, corrals, a bunkhouse, and an old stone smokehouse near the main house. His ranch hands were working the northern pasture, too far away. He could ride for them. But Eleanor wouldn't make it. And if he left her here, the men on the ridge would have her before he reached the barn. Caleb looked at the brass key in her hand. Then he looked at the riders. There's an old root cellar beneath the smokehouse. Will they find us? Probably. That doesn't sound comforting. It wasn't meant to. He grabbed the reins of the gray mare and cut it loose from the wagon. Run! They sprinted across the frozen yard. Bullets kicked dirt behind them. Caleb fired once. A rider fell from his horse. The others scattered. Eleanor ran beside Caleb, clutching the brass key. Halfway to the smokehouse, she stumbled. Caleb caught her arm. I can run. I know. Then let go. No. She looked at him for the first time. Something other than fear appeared in her eyes. Anger. I said let go. Caleb released her. She kept running. They reached the smokehouse just as another bullet struck the stone wall. Caleb shoved open the door. Inside was darkness. cold earth, and the smell of old smoke. Eleanor stepped through. Caleb followed. He pulled the door shut. For a few seconds, neither spoke. They could hear horses approaching, slowly, confidently. Someone dismounted outside. A man's voice carried through the wooden door. Mrs. Hart, Eleanor, closed her eyes. Caleb recognized the voice. Silas. Crow, I know you're here. His boots stopped directly. Outside, you have something that belongs to E. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She whispered. The ledger. Crow laughed softly. You have 10 seconds to come out. Caleb raised his revolver. Eleanor shook her. Head. He'll kill you. Caleb glanced at her. Maybe. Why aren't you afraid? I am. Then why are you staying? Caleb looked toward the door. Because being afraid never gave me a reason to abandon somebody. Outside, Crow began counting. 10. Caleb noticed something beneath the dirt. Floor. A loose wooden plank. He crouched and pulled it. Free. Underneath was an old stone-lined passage. Eleanor stared. Where does that go? Caleb looked at her. To the house. Crow reached 3. Caleb pointed toward the passage. You first. Eleanor hesitated. What about you? I'll be right behind you. You're lying. Probably. She almost laughed, despite herself. Then the smokehouse door exploded. Inward. Caleb fired. The first man through the doorway dropped. Eleanor disappeared into the passage. Caleb backed toward the opening, firing again as bullets tore through the walls. Then he heard Crow shout from outside. Mercer! Caleb stopped. Crow's voice was no longer amused. You don't understand what you're protecting. Caleb looked at the dark passage, then at the blood spreading across the floor. He knew men like Crow. They never stopped. When they lost, they simply changed what they were willing to destroy. Caleb stepped into the passage and pulled the wooden plank back into place. Behind him, Silas Crow entered the smokehouse, and on the other side of the wall, Eleanor Hart was already discovering something Caleb had never known existed beneath his own ranch, a locked iron door with a second brass keyhole, the same shape as the key hanging from her hand. Part 2, Eleanor pressed her palm against the iron door. It was cold enough to hurt. She looked back toward the passage. Caleb, no answer. Then came the muffled sound of gunfire from the smokehouse. Once, twice, then silence. Eleanor's breathing quickened. She lifted the brass key and slid it into the lock. It turned. The iron door opened inward with a long, rusty groan. Beyond it was a narrow chamber cut into the earth. There was no treasure, no weapons, only shelves, and on those shelves were boxes of old papers, property deeds, railroad contracts, and leather-bound account books. Eleanor stepped inside. A lantern hung from a hook on the wall. She struck a match. The flame revealed a date carved into the stone. Then she saw the name beneath it, Mercer Land Company. Eleanor's heart began to pound. Caleb Mercer had not known this room existed, but someone had used it for years. She opened the nearest ledger. Names filled the pages. Farmers, widows, homesteaders, men who had borrowed money during drought years and lost their land when the crops failed. But the numbers did not make sense. The debts were enormous, far larger than the original loans. Eleanor turned another page, then another. Her hands began to shake. The same names appeared in Silas Crow's freight records. Land had been purchased from struggling families for almost nothing, then resold through shell companies for 10 times the price. It wasn't just theft, it was a scheme. A scheme that had been operating across the county for nearly a decade, and her husband's ledger contained the proof. Eleanor heard footsteps above. She quickly closed the book. Someone was coming. She grabbed the lantern and moved deeper into the chamber. A second door stood at the far end. She opened it. It led into the basement beneath Caleb's ranch house. Eleanor stepped through just as the basement door above creaked open. Voices drifted down the stairs. "Search every room." A man's voice. Then another. "Crow said Mercer may have hidden the woman." Eleanor covered her mouth. There were men inside the house. She looked toward the stairs, then toward the basement window. Too small. She had nowhere to go. Suddenly, a hand covered her mouth. Eleanor nearly screamed. Caleb pulled her behind a stack of wooden crates. His face was streaked with blood. A bullet had grazed his temple. "You're alive," she whispered. "Disappointed?" She shook her head. "What happened?" "I convinced them I ran toward the creek." "You let them shoot you?" "I didn't exactly schedule it." Despite everything, Eleanor almost smiled. Then Caleb looked at the open iron door. "You found it? You knew about this?" "No." She handed him the ledger. "These records belong to your family." Caleb opened the book. His eyes moved across the pages. Then his face hardened. "My father." "What?" "This land company was started by my father." Eleanor stared at him. "You knew?" "I knew he owned land. Not this? No." Caleb turned another page. His father's signature appeared at the bottom, but beneath it was a second signature. Silas Crow. Caleb closed the ledger. "My father died owing Crow money." Eleanor frowned. What if he wasn't in debt? Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean?" What if Crow made him look like he was? Caleb said nothing. Eleanor pointed to the figures. "Look at these dates. Your father's debt was supposedly transferred to Crow 3 months after your father died." Caleb stared. "That isn't possible. It is if someone forged the transfer." He turned another page. There it was, a payment made to the county clerk. Then another, then another. Caleb slowly sat down on the cellar steps. For 20 years he had believed his father had ruined the family through bad business. He had spent his entire life trying to build something clean from the wreckage. Now he was staring at proof that his father's failure may have been manufactured. Eleanor crouched beside him. "Your father wasn't the only victim." Caleb looked at the names. "I know." Footsteps sounded above them again. Caleb stood. "We need to get out." "Where?" "There's a storm cellar behind the barn. Can we trust your ranch hands?" "Most of them." "Most?" "One of them has been missing since yesterday." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Crow's man?" "Probably." Caleb took the ledger. "You need to keep the key." "Why?" "Because whatever Crow wants is locked behind that door." They climbed through the rear tunnel and emerged behind the barn. The sky had turned dark. Snow had begun falling. Caleb looked toward the main road. A dozen riders were approaching. Not Crow's men, the sheriff, and behind him came 6 armed ranchers from neighboring properties. Eleanor stared. "Who are they?" "People Crow has cheated." Caleb walked toward the riders. The sheriff dismounted. "Mercer, Sheriff, we heard shots. You're late." The sheriff looked past him. "Where's Mrs. Hart?" Eleanor stepped from behind the barn. The sheriff's face changed. "Good Lord." She held up the ledger. "This is why they killed my husband." The sheriff stared at it. Then he looked toward the road. "We need to leave." Caleb frowned. "Why?" "Because Crow owns the county bank." "So?" "So he owns half the sheriff's office." The sheriff lowered his voice. I don't have enough men to arrest him. Caleb looked at the ranchers gathered behind him. You might now. One of the older ranchers stepped forward. Crow had taken his spread 2 winters earlier. Another man had lost his cattle. A third had lost his son's homestead. One by one, they moved closer. Nobody drew a weapon. They didn't need to. For the first time, Silas Crow was facing something money could not easily buy. People who had nothing left to lose. The sheriff looked at Caleb. We need evidence strong enough to put Crow away for good. Eleanor held up the ledger. This is only half of it. Caleb looked at her. What do you mean? My husband hid the second book. Where? She touched the brass key. He told me the first book would lead me to the second. Caleb glanced toward the smokehouse, the iron room. No. Eleanor shook her head. He said the second book wasn't hidden on your ranch. Then where? She looked toward the distant railroad tracks, at Crow's warehouse. Caleb understood. The warehouse was nearly 10 miles away, and Crow would know by now that the ledger had been found. They had to get there before him. The sheriff grabbed Caleb's arm. You can't ride into that place. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She can. The sheriff stared. What? She knows what we're looking for. Eleanor stepped forward. And I'm going. Caleb looked at her. No. Her expression hardened. You don't get to decide that. You've already been shot at today. So have you. That's different. How? Caleb opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Eleanor stepped closer. You've spent the last few hours risking your life because my husband trusted you. If we're going to finish what he started, you're going to have to trust me too. Caleb studied her, then he nodded. All right. They rode before sunset. The storm grew worse as they crossed the open prairie. Caleb rode beside Eleanor. For several miles, neither spoke. Finally, she said, You were wrong about me. About what? You said I picked a bad place to hide. You did. She smiled faintly. Then why are you smiling? Because I'm beginning to think you picked the right man. Caleb looked at her. That sentence stayed between them longer than either expected. By midnight, they reached Crow's warehouse. It sat beside the railroad tracks like a fortress. No lights showed from the upper windows, but Caleb could see guards moving near the loading dock. Eleanor pointed. There. A freight wagon stood beside the warehouse. Its rear doors were open. 2 men carried crates inside. Caleb dismounted. You stay here. Eleanor grabbed his sleeve. No. He looked at her hand. She released him. I'm coming. They entered through a side door. Inside, the warehouse smelled of coal dust, grain, and oil. They moved between stacks of wooden crates. Eleanor spotted a small office above the loading floor. The brass key was suddenly heavy in her hand. They climbed the stairs. The office was locked. Eleanor inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside was a desk, and beneath it, a metal safe. Caleb opened the safe with a crowbar. Inside was a second ledger. Alongside it were signed contracts and a packet of letters. Eleanor picked up the first letter. It was from her husband. She read it silently. Then her face went pale. What? She handed it to Caleb. He read the final lines. Crow had discovered the investigation. Her husband had known he was going to die, but the letter contained something else, a name, the county judge, and beside it the name of the man who had ordered the murder. Silas Crow. Caleb folded the letter. Now we have enough. A slow clap came from the doorway. They turned. Silas Crow stood there. He wore a black coat and a calm smile. 6 men stood behind him. I was wondering how long it would take, Crow said. Caleb stepped in front of Eleanor. Crow laughed. You still think this is about protecting a woman? Caleb's hand moved toward his revolver. No. Crow's smile faded. This is about everything you've stolen. Crow looked at Eleanor. Your husband understood the rules. He found out too much. He died because you murdered him. He died because he believed paperwork could beat power. Eleanor stepped beside Caleb. You're wrong. Crow raised an eyebrow. Am I? You forgot one thing. What? My husband wasn't the only one who kept records. Crow's face changed. Eleanor held up the letters. I sent copies to the newspaper before I ever came here. For the first time, Crow looked afraid. Caleb saw it. That was the moment he knew they had won. Not because Crow was surrounded. Not because they had more guns. Because Crow's greatest weapon had always been secrecy, and now the truth was loose. Crow reached for his pistol. Caleb fired first. The gunshot shattered the warehouse. One of Crow's men dropped his weapon. Another ran. The sheriff and ranchers stormed through the lower doors. Within minutes, the warehouse was surrounded. Crow stood frozen beside his desk. The sheriff walked toward him. Silas Crow, you're under arrest. Crow looked at Caleb. You think this ends here? Caleb shook his head. No. He glanced at Eleanor. It ends when every family gets back what you took. Crow was led away. Outside, snow covered the railroad tracks. Eleanor stood beside Caleb beneath the warehouse lantern. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, My husband wanted the truth. He got it. No, she looked at Caleb. We did. Caleb smiled. You planning to stay? Eleanor looked toward the dark prairie. I don't have a home anymore. Caleb's expression softened. You could. Where? He looked toward the distant lights of his ranch. I've got a spare room. She smiled. Just a room. For now. And what happens after now? Caleb looked at her for a long moment. That's something worth finding. Out! Spring came slowly to Mercer. Ranch. The snow disappeared from the fence. Lines. The creek broke free of the ice. Eleanor opened a small office in town where families could bring their land. Papers without fear. She helped the sheriff uncover the remaining records. The stolen properties were returned one by one. And Caleb never told anyone that he had fallen in love with her. He didn't need to. He showed it in smaller ways. A repaired porch step, a cup of coffee waiting before. Sunrise, a new saddle hanging beside hers. And one evening, as the sun disappeared behind the western hills, Eleanor stood on the porch and watched Caleb ride in from the pasture. He stopped. Beneath the cottonwoods. She walked down to meet him. You're late? Had a fence down. You always have an excuse. Usually a good one. She smiled. Then she noticed something tied to his saddle, a small brass key. Caleb removed it and placed it in her hand. What is this? The key to the old cellar. I thought we didn't need it anymore. We don't. Then why give it to me? Caleb looked toward the ranch house. Because 20 years ago, my father lost everything because powerful men decided he had no voice. He looked back at her. I spent half my life trying to prove I wasn't like him. Eleanor waited. Turns out, Caleb continued, I was looking at the wrong thing. What were you looking for? He smiled. A reason to trust somebody. Eleanor closed her fingers around the key. And did you find one? Caleb stepped closer. I think I did. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods. For once, there was no gunfire, no men chasing them, no locked doors, just two people who had survived enough hardship to understand the value of peace. Eleanor looked at him. You know, Caleb Mercer, that was a terrible way to begin a courtship. He laughed. I never claimed to know much about courtship. Good. Why good? Because I don't want a man who knows everything. She slipped her hand into his. I'd rather have one who knows when to listen. Caleb squeezed her hand, and for the first time in many years, the rancher who had spent his life building walls around his heart allowed someone to walk through them. The Old West was full of men who measured their worth by the size of their land, the number of cattle in their pasture, or the money locked inside their safes. Caleb Mercer learned something. Different, a man's fortune was not measured by what he could keep. It was measured by what he was willing to stand for when keeping it would have been easier. And Eleanor learned that losing everything did not mean losing the future. Sometimes the road to a new life began with nothing, more than a broken wagon, a brass key, and the courage to knock on the door of a stranger. So, if you were in Eleanor's place, would you have trusted Caleb when he offered you shelter? Or would you have kept riding into the unknown? Tell me what you would have done in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. If you enjoy heartfelt stories of the Old West, subscribe and join us for the next journey across the frontier.